So,
Hello, everybody. Welcome to Writer's Lunch. It's good to have y'all here today. Thanks for coming. Today, I'm going to be talking about, this is going to be first in a three-part series. I'm going to be talking about science and magic in fiction. So this week, I'm going to be talking about the empirical, which is science in fiction. So we'll be covering technology, mostly technology, but we'll also be covering like biology and a little bit of chemistry and a little bit of physics as well. Basically, just like, some strategies for how to write with science and how you can kind of classify your books based on how strict you are with scientific accuracy and things like that. Next week, Shannon, do you remember what's
yeah,
next?
it's me, and I'm going to be doing reverse outlines for authors. So, if you've never made a reverse outline, a reverse outline is the outline you make after you've written your zero draft or your first draft so that you can actually get an understanding of what went on the page, because oftentimes it's not what's in your head. And then oftentimes as well, what's in your head may not actually be the final vision for your story. So the reverse outline helps you to get really good understanding of where your plot is, where your subplots are, if things are missing, and really helps you to determine if you've got a well-rounded story. So that's what we're going to be talking about, how to make them, how to evaluate your draft, all that good stuff so that you can continue on in your writing journey towards a finished draft that you'll publish.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, that should be good. Reverse outlines are a tool that I use as well, and they're very helpful, and you can do lots of different things with reverse outlines. So, well, all right. So I guess let's go ahead and get into this. So again, this is the first in a three-part series because, talking about science and magic and fiction, there's too much to cover to, talk about it in just an hour. So my writer's lunches for the next 2 months, we tend to generally do one per month, each of us. So next month I'll be talking about magic fiction, and then in September I'll be talking about like combining science and magic and fiction.
So real quick, I would love
Yeah.
you to tell people who maybe don't know about your previous experiences before being a writer,
Sure.
how you come by this knowledge, honestly.
Sure, yeah. So, yes, for those of you who know me, I mean, I think most of you have been to Writer's Lunch before. I usually just introduce myself as a science fiction and fantasy author, which is true. I'm an editor at Homeworks, which is true. What you may not know about me is that I also have a master's degree in biology. I worked as a field biologist for a little bit before, becoming an author and an editor. So I do have quite a bit of experience with biology, at least, scientific practices in general as well. And so yeah, that's where a lot of this kind of knowledge and thought processes kind of come from. But it also comes from, my love of fiction and of, technology and science in fiction. I'm also a big Star Trek fan, and we're going to be not talking about Star Trek specifically, but Star Trek does feature as at least one example for some of the technology stuff I'm going to be talking about today. So, and that's my cat, Stella, with Star Trek on the TV in the background, appropriately. All right,
I
so
feel very smart right now because I know that's Jordy and he's doing something with the warp drive.
yes. So, what is the empirical? And the empirical sciences are the testable sciences. So this is not, and kind of bummed that Sean's not here because he and I had a discussion the other night. This does not include theoretical physics because theoretical physics is not testable. I will fight on that. But it's theoretical. You can't, anyway. Yeah, we don't need to get into that. But we're going to be talking about, technology, which is, kind of a synthesis of science and scientific ideas. And then we're going to, break it down a little more into the scientific fields of biology, chemistry, and physics, not theoretical physics, but it comes into it a little bit. But I have here in my graphic the process of empirical science, where you go through observations, questions, hypothesis, experiment, analysis, conclusion, and then it keeps going in a circle. From your conclusion, you have more observations, and then you just keep going. So, but in fiction, science kind of centers on technology in general. When people think science in fiction, particularly in science fiction, they're thinking technology, warp drives, anti-gravity or, artificial gravity, growing plants on other planets, or like the technology that we need to survive on other planets. Most of the time, people are thinking of technology when they think of this. But this also includes biology and chemistry too, especially when you're in like a world building phase. Biology and chemistry are things that, and even physics are things that, you as the author who's doing the world building, these are things that are in your mind, even if you don't really know that they're in your mind, because you're building an alien world, and so there's biology involved, and there's chemistry involved, and there's physics involved with alien worlds. So even if you don't have a lot of scientific knowledge or a lot of scientific background, you exist in the context of all human science. And so, there's understanding that kind of percolates through your brain, and these ideas that percolate through your brain that come out when you're writing fiction that you may not realize. So I'm going to start with speculative technology, specifically the hard-soft spectrum of technology. Generally categorize science fiction, especially, as hard versus soft. And again, usually when people are thinking about hard or soft sci-fi, they're thinking about technology. And this has to do with how possible or how plausible it is for fictional technologies to exist in the real world. So in general, in hard science fiction, the technology that is on the page in that fiction is going to be technology that is either possible in the real world, and we know that it's possible, and maybe not be developed yet in the real world, but we know we could do it, or it's plausible in that we know, maybe the science isn't quite there yet, but in the future, if we develop our ideas and our science and our understanding a little bit more, such a thing would be plausible to develop, even though we couldn't necessarily do it right now. Now, and then, on the other hand, in soft sci-fi, generally the technology is, you're not really constrained by that boundary of technology needing to be possible or plausible. You can invent technology that could never exist in the real world because it violates the laws of physics. Because you're writing soft sci-fi, that doesn't matter as much for it to be possible. Now, these boundaries between hard and soft sci-fi are not definite. In practice, it's more of a spectrum than a binary, where you might have some technologies that are hard in that they are possible or plausible, and then other technologies that are soft in that they're not. And one really good example of this is one of my favorite space operas that I have ever read, which is the Revelation Space series by Alastair Reynolds. And Sean and I, again, I'm sorry Sean's not here, because he and I debated this one when I was getting ready for this presentation.
I'll pretend to be Sean. I'll just be like, I disagree. But you'll have to fill in what he actually said, because I don't know.
Because this series, to me, is soft sci-fi. There is a lot of technology in this book that is not based on our understanding of science that we have today. A lot of the technology in these books is not possible.
I disagree.
And,
I don't.
Yeah, but Sean disagreed with me. He said, "Well, Alastair Reynolds is a theoretical physicist, and he based a lot of his technology on his understanding of physics. But again, theoretical physics is not empirical science. It's not testable, so we can't know for sure if it's real or not."
I'd like to also, this is not me pretending to be Sean. I want to point out that there has been a shift in the definitions or the denotations of hard versus soft science fiction over the course of the last 60 years. So if you were having a conversation about hard versus soft science fiction, and it was the late 1970s, early 1970s, when you talk about soft science fiction, they would have talked about what they considered soft science, which is psychology and sciences that are of the mind, or things that they were looking into but hadn't proven whether or not it was science or not, like telekinesis, stuff like that. And so if you see something written from an author who is from those previous generations and they mention soft science fiction and hard science fiction in ways that don't seem like they make a lot of sense, it is probably because they are using these now antiquated terms for sciences that they considered to be softer, or in a terrible way, more womanly, because it always comes back to that. Whereas now we look at these things as accurate to science versus maybe a little bit fuzzy. So just for some clarity there, because, again, even if you are from a previous generation, this may seem weird to you if you grew up with those other definitions for these terms.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because I will mention later when I kind of go into, what makes it hard versus what makes it soft. Hard science fiction tends to emphasize, the technology tends to be kind of a central focus or a central theme of the work, versus soft science fiction, where the technology exists to serve the actual work, and the focus is more on the humanity aspect. And so that, I think, is kind of a relic of that older definition of hard versus soft sci-fi, where hard is the hard sciences and soft is the soft sciences like psychology and things like that.
Yeah.
So
I mean, and
I
with
think
the
that
sorry.
yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
With like the old definition, you would look at space opera, which we wouldn't
Mhm.
consider to be hard science fiction now, but that would have been considered hard sci-fi back in the day,
Mhm.
because it had to do with physics, even if the physics was fuzzy.
Mhm.
Whereas now we would say, no, the physics is fuzzy, now it's soft.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but yeah, so this particular series, I do consider it to be soft sci-fi. There's a lot of like woo-woo technology stuff in here that doesn't make any sense, but it's fun. You know, it doesn't have to make sense. It's fun. It serves the story and, you know, it does what it needs to do. Sean, however, considers this series to be hard sci-fi, and I will concede the author himself considers it to be hard sci-fi, so like, you know, I did, you know, do some reading about it after Sean and I debated this, and the author himself does consider it to be hard sci-fi, but again, he's a theoretical physicist, so his science can't be tested anyway. So I'm gonna, you know, push up my glasses on that one. But again, the boundaries between hard and soft science fiction are not definite. It's like I said, it's more of a spectrum than a binary in practice. And so you could have some technologies that are like, yes, this is possible. We could do this right now with our understanding of science. Or, you know, this is something that we need to develop our understanding a little bit more, but we could probably do it. Versus I might have other pieces of technology that are like, no, this violates the laws of physics and we can never do it. Like if you have, let's say if you have, you know, warp drives, FTL travel violates the laws of physics, can't be done. But then you might also have, you know, other technologies that could possibly be done. And this classification also depends partly on how your readers perceive the technology in your work. And so you may get some disagreements among readers of whether you are writing hard or soft technology in your science fiction, depending on the reader's understanding of science. And so one thing when you're writing and when you're world building, one thing that's really important to do is decide where on this spectrum you want to fall before you start. Because, you know, if you want to write hard sci-fi, you want to write, you know, plausible or possible technology, you're going to have to do research, and that's going to you know, impact your world building and your story as well. So hard science fiction, again, like I said, these stories tend to, not always, these stories do prioritize tech that is possible or plausible in the real world, which I've already described a few times. And these stories tend to serve the technology, where the technology is kind of like a main focus or a main theme of the story. And, you know, everything is kind of written around this, you know, idea that the technology is possible. And, you know, I've already mentioned faster than light travel. In hard science fiction, it depends. You know, baseline, FTL travel violates the laws of physics in whatever understanding. And so it's not possible. And so a lot of hard science fiction does not have FTL travel. Now, there are some works of hard science fiction, or science fiction that a lot of readers and even like the authors would consider to be hard science fiction, that do feature certain versions of FTL travel that are considered more plausible based on our understanding of science. But it really just depends. You're not going to get, you know, like a Star Wars style hyperdrive in something that is hard science fiction, but you might get something more like, I can't think of an example off the top of my head, but in general, you're going to be dealing with the effects of time dilation. And so when you're ignoring, if you have an FTL drive that allows you to ignore time dilation, then, you know, that's not going to be hard science fiction. But there are some versions, some ideas out there about FTL drives that do have to deal with time dilation, and those are sometimes lumped into, like, works that include those are sometimes lumped into hard science fiction. In this category, especially on the extremely hard end of the spectrum, you can also get fiction books that are essentially tech manuals, and I will tell you about one of those a little bit later. Or I think probably on my next slide. So, you know, and there are readers who like that. You know, that's it's not my thing, but like there are readers out there who like, you know, books that, you know, go into extreme depth explaining how all of their technology works. Okay, not on my next slide, but on the next one. So if you are writing hard science fiction, I mentioned you're going to have to do research. you need to know your stuff, because the readers of hard science fiction know their stuff, or at least they think they do. They will, if you're claiming to be writing hard science fiction, you're marketing your books to a hard science fiction crowd, they are going to expect scientific accuracy, or at the very least, scientific plausibility from your work. So you're going to have to do research, make sure that every technology that you're including in your work is at the very least plausible, if not possible. And again, I mentioned a couple times, a lot of times these stories have the tech or the science as a central theme or a focus of the story. It's not necessary for hard science fiction, but it's a lot of times what readers kind of expect, because they don't want, the technology, the real stuff, they don't want it to fade into the background. They want it to be front and center. They want it to be, maybe the central crux of the plot, or a central theme for the characters. And you should also consider possibility versus plausibility, because again, those are different. And whether you are working in the realm of technology that is possible versus plausible will determine the type of story that you can, kind of tell. If you're working in, with only technology that is possible, then you're going to be a little bit more limited in terms of the type of story you can tell, or how far into the future you can go, because, you have to work within this realm of technology that we know is possible. Versus plausible, you can be a little bit more loosey-goosey. You can go a little bit further into the future and imagine, technologies that are a little bit different, but you kind of need to decide where you want to fall on that scale. And again, like I said, the more advanced you get, the farther into the future, the more advanced you get with the technology, the more suspension of disbelief your readers are going to need to feel that the technology is plausible. All right, so here's some examples of what I would consider hard science fiction. The first one on the left is Eon by Greg Bear. This is a tech manual. I love science fiction. I love space opera. I love, whatever. This is the only book I have ever DNF'd, because halfway through, we completely lost the entire plot of the story in favor of explaining how all of the technology worked that they were dealing with. And I couldn't read it anymore, because by the time we got back to the plot, 80 pages later, I had forgotten what the plot was. And so I haven't finished that book. It's not my thing, but there is an audience for it out there. If that's the kind of thing, you want to write books where you're explaining all this technology and you are convincing both yourself and your readers that this technology works and is possible and does not violate the laws of physics, go for it. There are readers out there who will read that. I will politely decline, but, you'll find your people. The three body problem, I also consider to be hard science fiction. It's based on some physics questions that we deal with, but all of the science and technology and the physics in this book are things that have been, tested and proven, and we know that they exist. The Martian, very hard sci-fi. Very good book, very good movie, but it's a very different kind of very hard sci-fi. Whoopsie. It's a very different kind of very hard sci-fi from Eon, because he doesn't go into a lot of depth explaining how the technology works. He just works us through his logical process of how he's figuring out how to survive on Mars based on, what he has at hand. And it's all, again, very, very hard sci-fi. Children of Time, I also consider this to be hard sci-fi, but it's a little bit less so than the other three. And it's more hard sci-fi in the sense of the biology than the technology. So Children of Time is about a race of sentient spiders who are encountering humanity for the first time. And all of the biology in terms of the spiders and their society and their thought processes and their how they interact with each other, how they interact with humanity. It's all based on, and you can tell when you're reading it that this is really based in real biological principles, a real understanding of how real spiders work, and just extrapolating that out to giving them sentience. But the actual technology in terms of humanity arriving at this alien planet and whatever, and trying to set up a colony and stuff, it's not all very hard sci-fi in terms of the technology, but in terms of the biology, it is. So that one's a little bit different. But again, like I said, hard versus soft sci-fi is a spectrum. It's not strictly a binary. So you can have some things that are more hard than others. All right. So soft science fiction. We'll get into that one now. In soft science fiction, when you're writing, soft science, technology does not have to be possible or even plausible. Essentially, you can go nuts. So this is where you get your Star Wars style hyperdrives where, you don't have to worry about time dilation or anything like that. So in like soft science fiction, the tech generally serves the story. So you have technology in there, you have what technology you need in there to tell the story that you want to tell. And not always, but a lot of times these stories prioritize human emotions over scientific accuracy, which is kind of what Shannon was talking about earlier, where this older definition of hard versus soft sci-fi means the hard sciences versus the soft sciences. This, I think, is kind of an artifact of that, where these types of stories tend to prioritize, what makes us human, stories about, what makes us human, or, basically like the human element, right? But again, that's not always the case. So really just depends. So when you're writing soft science fiction, take the time to enjoy the world building process, because you're not really constrained by what's possible or what's plausible. You can still do research, to have kind of an idea of like, what's possible and extrapolate from there, but you don't necessarily have to. And you can consider using the plot to inform your tech or your science, rather than the other way around. But you should always consider suspension of disbelief. How much disbelief are you asking readers to suspend? Or how much disbelief do you want to ask your readers to suspend? Because, the more wild you get with your technology, the less it feels like technology and the more it starts feeling like magic. But whatever you do, you should maintain internal consistency and logic. And that's going to help with this suspension of disbelief. If your world is internally consistent and internally logical, then readers are going to be able to suspend a lot more disbelief for that than a world where readers can tell there's no consistency to it. And again, consider having, the human element as a central theme or focus of your story, but you can also focus on, fantastical technology and things like that. It really just depends on what kind of story you're trying to tell. So some examples of what I would consider to be soft science fiction, and these are all books that I really like. Memory Called Empire by Arkady Martine. It deals with colonization, but also like ancestral memory and the importance of continuity in like cultural memory and things like that. So there's some weird memory stuff where we're downloading, other people's memories into a new person's brain and things like that. But like that's kind of what the whole story is about, is like, this memory is supposed to have continuity and for some reason it doesn't. And we have to figure out why. But it really is focused on kind of like the human element of the story. The technology is background decoration. It's about, the people, the characters, the culture and things like that. Hyperion by Dan Simmons. This is a great series. It gets really weird. I read it a long time ago, but I really liked it. And it has some like cultural mythological bases and stuff, but it's basically, people are being haunted by this kind of supernatural technological creature. And they're kind of being haunted by it over the course of like, was it 4 or 5 books? But yeah, it's a good series. Definitely like consider picking that up if you're looking for kind of a weird sci-fi. And it's mostly planetary based. But Ancillary Justice by Anne Leckie deals with cloning and like humans as bodies for AIs. It's interesting and it's weird and I love it. And it's a series, but it's really good. And then A Long Way to a Small Angry Planet. This is cozy space opera. We've talked about cozy fiction on here before. This is cozy space opera. It's about found family, but again, like the technology kind of fades into the background. Yeah, they're in space. They're traveling through space. They're on a spaceship the whole time. But the story is about the characters and the people. All right. So let's talk a little bit about speculative biology. So how do you make your invented worlds kind of come alive? Because biology is about living things. So I gave a presentation on speculative biology a few months ago. Was it last year? I think it was last year. So, I'm not going to get super in depth. You can go back to that writer's lunch and watch it if you want to learn more about speculative biology. But some basic approaches to speculative biology, if you're trying to do kind of like a hard speculative biology, right? Because we have the hard versus soft spectrum. And, most people think of it in terms of technology, but it also applies to the other scientific fields as well. So it also applies to biology. So if you're trying to be scientifically rigorous and write hard speculative biology, you're going to want your invented ecosystems to be rooted in real biological principles, where you're thinking about predator-prey interactions, how environmental factors influence evolution, niches, etc. You don't have to be scientifically rigorous when you're inventing an alien world. And in fact, I would argue that even if you don't have much of an understanding of biology, of like the biological principles and how an ecosystem is built in the real world, even if you don't have that education, I would argue you probably understand it better than you think you do, because I'm trying to figure out how to say this. We exist in the context of our world, right? And obviously we've built systems to separate us from nature, but we still have to deal with, and we see every day how, different animals, different humans interact with each other, and how that affects behavior, and how weather can affect behavior, and how geography can affect, behavior, and the things that you need to wear, or the kinds of animals that live in those places. You see that every day. We're inundated with that every day, even if we're not outside all the time. So you don't need much biological education in order to create a simple ecosystem. You just need to think about how the ecosystems on Earth that you are familiar with, and what kinds of animals and plants live there, and think about how they interact with each other. But and mainly, I think the main thing when you're, inventing a world, the main thing to consider is how the environment, which would be your weather, temperature, water availability, your geography, things like that. How does that affect the plants and animals that grow there? One really good example of a fully realized speculative biology world is this show on Netflix called Scavenger's Reign. And I have a screenshot of it here. But it's very good. It's only a few episodes, and I really hope that they set it up for a sequel. I really hope they come back with a sequel series. But it's about people who have crash landed on this, alien planet, and they're trying to figure out how to, survive and, get back to civilization. And so as we go through the story, you see several different environments that these people are exposed to, and the kinds of alien creatures and plants that live there. So it's really very good and very, very alien. So I definitely recommend checking that out if you haven't watched it already. So some examples, Shannon says it's so influenced by 70s French sci-fi.
Sorry, that's totally me and my Mobius section.
It's Sean pretending to be Shannon.
Everybody is me until proven otherwise. Let's see what we live in.
But some examples of speculative biology that I really like. Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer. And this book is about biological change. And so I definitely recommend checking it out. It was made into a movie. The movie's pretty good, but the book is a lot better, and it really gets more into the change aspect and the weirdness of biology than the movie does. Avatar, Blue People version of Avatar. This is a very good example of speculative biology. If it's nothing else, it's a very good example of a fully realized speculative world where you have all of these animals and people that have certain ways of interacting with each other that are influenced by their having evolved in this same environment. Another really good example is Dragon Riders of Pern, and this deals with a little bit more with genetic engineering, which does, but genetic engineering of dragons. And that's not what the story's about, but that is part of the world building of the story, is that speculative biology element. All right, let's see, how am I doing? Okay, I'm doing okay. So now let's talk a little bit about speculative chemistry. This might be one you don't think about quite as much. And, this might be something that doesn't come so much into science fiction as maybe it comes into, hi baby, as maybe it comes into fantasy a little bit more with magic systems that deal with fictional chemistry. But whenever you have, invented minerals, invented compounds, if you're doing alchemy, I have Full Metal Alchemist on here. These are, small elements of speculative chemistry that you are going to have to deal with in your story. Because, if you're inventing a mineral or a compound that has, they have unique chemical properties that could affect, technology, biology, magic, and, really anything. A popular trope that actually, scientists, biologists, exochemists have kind of been looking into is the possibility of silicon-based life versus carbon-based life. We are carbon-based. Our genetic structure and all of our cells and all the molecules that make us up are carbon-based. That's kind of our building block molecule is carbon. And but there's this possibility that fiction kind of likes to explore, and again, like I said, the exo or astro fields of biology and physics are kind of exploring this idea as well, of the possibility of life forms based on other molecules, particularly silicon-based life forms. So, and what would a life form whose building block molecule is silicon instead of carbon, what would that look like? Because that affects all of the, body chemistry, which would affect, how your body could look, what it could do, and, things like that. So what you could eat, and, just all kinds of stuff. So that's a very popular kind of chemistry-based trope in speculative fiction. And again, as with biology and as with technology, your speculative chemistry can be more or less scientifically rigorous. Obviously, if you're doing alchemy, where you're transmuting, compounds into other compounds, that's not scientifically rigorous. But if you're doing actual chemistry, and you just have some minerals or compounds that you've invented that undergo real chemical reactions in order to become a different compound, then that would be a little bit more scientifically rigorous than, alchemy. So some examples of speculative chemistry. Again, we have Blue People Avatar on here. Unobtainium. That is an invented mineral that is the basis for their ability to conduct space travel. So that is their speculative chemistry element, is they're dependent on how the way this fictional mineral reacts chemically to be able to, produce fuel for their spaceships or whatever. Star Trek is on here as well for the same reason. Dilithium crystals, they are dependent on the chemistry of dilithium crystals and the kinds of, chemical bonds that they can create and break and whatever in order to power their warp drives. So that's their invented mineral that allows them to travel at FTL speeds. So that's actually a pretty common trope in sci-fi, is that you have some invented mineral, something that has unique chemical properties that allows you to violate the laws of physics and travel at faster than light speeds. So that's a pretty common trope. Another example in the fantasy realm of speculative chemistry is Mistborn. Mistborn deals with different metals that power the magic in different ways. And the way those metals react within the body allows people who can use them to do different things. It's been a long time since I've read this book, but this is when I talk about magic next month, I'm going to talk about Mistborn a little bit more, because this is a very hard magic system. And so we're going to be talking about, the hard, soft spectrum as it relates to magic as well, like we did with technology this time. So Mistborn's going to come back. But this is an example of speculative chemistry, because the magic is dependent on how these different metals interact within the body to produce, magical powers. All right. Okay, I'm doing okay on time. Speculative physics. Well, what are we talking about when we're talking about speculative physics? So we are talking about a lot of softer speculative fiction tends to violate real life physics. I've talked about FTL travel. I haven't really talked about artificial gravity, but we've touched on, magic, superpowers. If you're doing a superhero story, a lot of superpowers tend to violate the laws of physics. And so anyway, yeah, I have My Hero Academia on here as an example, because a lot of the characters' powers do, violate the laws of physics as we understand them. So a lot of times when you're writing softer science fiction, you're dealing with physics or with violations of the laws of physics, even if you're not really thinking about physics a lot while you're writing it. Sci-fi likes to play with gravity, space-time, atomics, time dilation, all of those things have to do with the laws of physics in the real world. Or, maybe in a invented world that has slightly different laws of physics than we do. So in general, physics is a little bit different than some of the other branches of science. And Sean put in here dimensions. Yeah, dimensions. If you're dealing with alternate realities and parallel universes and things like that, you're dealing with physics.
And I love the idea of, like the line where you draw between hard and soft, like we were talking about, kind of depends on where your suspension of disbelief is. Like, if you're like entertaining, string theory and stuff like that, you might consider something harder than someone who's like, oh no, there's no way that exists.
Right. Yeah, and we talked about experimental physics, which is testable, versus theoretical physics, which is not testable. And, what you're kind of dealing with in that sense.
Oh, Einstein, Bohr, all of those started out as theoretical physics, man.
That's true.
But that's a survivorship bias. There's all sorts of, ideas that are out there that were theoretical and then stopped because they were proven impossible.
Yeah. But and that's the thing is that, as our understanding of science develops and as our technology develops, things that are previously untestable do sometimes become testable.
Yeah. Asimov, and sorry to interrupt, Asimov was harder when he wrote it than he is today.
We also talked about before that the definition of hard versus soft or the definitions of hard and soft have kind of changed. So, and that has something to do with it as well, that, Asimov, his books were dealing with the hard sciences, not the soft sciences. And so based on the old definition of hard versus soft, he would be considered hard. But based on how we kind of think of it today, he's a little bit softer. But yeah, let me see. Okay. Sorry, I was looking at the chat. So when you are violating or inventing laws of physics, those things are generally shown on the page through technology and biology and chemistry rather than, being told to you. You're not going to write a fiction book explaining how in this world the laws of physics are different. Or, maybe you might have like a section at the beginning that's like, hey, yeah, in this world, we have proven that string theory exists, or like, whatever. Like, you may have some brief explanation, but you're not going to really be talking about in the text how the physics is different. You're going to be showing how it's different based on how it has affected technology and the other branches of speculative science. Okay. So some examples of books that they don't necessarily deal specifically or intentionally with speculative physics, but speculative physics is an important element of these books. Ringworld by Larry Niven, which is, about this world that's been built in a ring around the sun. It's been a really long time since I read it. But it was pretty good. I remember it being pretty good. The Long Earth, which deals with kind of, it's not really parallel universes, but it's contiguous universes, if that makes sense. Instead of being beside each other, they're in a line with each other. And this is by Terry Pratchett, who I love, but it's also co-authored by Stephen Baxter. But it does still have some of that, a little bit of that Terry Pratchett flair of humor to it. But it's a series. There are like 3 books, I think. But The Long Earth is pretty good. Recommend it. And then on the more fantasy side, Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab. This does deal with parallel universes, where the main character the universes are supposed to be closed off from each other, but the main character finds out he has some power to travel in between them. Or he does because of his job or something. I don't remember. But it becomes a whole big mess because of going in between these universes. So also, oh my God, what's the movie? The movie that came out that was about parallel universes. I don't remember.
I mean, that could be one of a whole bunch.
I know, but it was the really big one that came out recently, like last year or the year before, with the bagel, the everything bagel.
Oh, Everything Everywhere All at Once.
There we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
With the bagel was a great hint. Thank you for that.
Yeah. That is kind of an absurdist, it's a little bit absurdist movie, but it does deal with, parallel universes and traveling between those parallel universes and trying to change things that happen.
It felt absurdist, but at the same time, it came out at the perfect time versus the Marvel universe to absolutely ridicule everything that they were doing.
Yeah.
But it was also terribly heartfelt. I'm going to recommend that movie, like, because although it is speculative, sci-fi, all that, it's also like a heartwarming family story.
It made me cry. Like, it made me I had an emotional reaction to that movie. It's a very good movie. But anyway, parallel universes, multi-dimensions, that's a very popular trope in science fiction that, this is speculative physics that we're doing. We don't know whether parallel universes, parallel dimensions exist. And so, this is a speculative physics element that is a very popular trope in science fiction. I think particularly right now, I feel like it's kind of having a moment. It's more popular than it used to be. Anyway, but yeah. So then, we've talked about technology, we've talked about biology, we've talked about chemistry and physics. So, how do we go about in our writing? I only have a few minutes left. In our writing, how do we go about putting it all together? And we've talked about, some kind of strategies for writing with these different branches of science, writing with technology. But the speculative sciences are aspects of world building that, as you kind of build your story, build your invented, worlds and, characters and whatever, these are things that, you kind of have to consider to a greater or lesser extent as you're kind of preparing to write your story. They do exist in context with each other, so they should influence each other. If you are inventing a world where the life forms are silicon-based instead of carbon-based, that will affect, obviously that affects their biology. That will affect their technology. Their technology would be different than ours based on, their biology. It affects, their chemistry, what they can eat, what they can't eat, what they're sensitive to versus not sensitive to. Obviously it affects, physics as well. So they all kind of exist within this context, and they should be influencing each other. You can't just have a silicon-based life form that exists completely separate from any other world context. And, it's completely the same as a human, except that, it's silicon-based. But, it can eat whatever humans eat, and it can, survive. It can breathe air just like humans do, and it can, survive on Earth just like humans do, or it can survive in a human spaceship without any special protection. That's not how, silicon-based life form, if they were real, would not be able to do all those things. So those are things you have to consider when, if you want to have a silicon-based life form in your world, think about these other things that would be affected by the fact that it has a silicon-based chemistry. You don't necessarily need to cover all the fields of science. Really, what you need to focus on is what serves the story that you're trying to tell. We've said this before when talking about world building, that you can really get lost in the weeds. And if you're trying to think about, all different aspects of many different sciences that you need to consider, for your world building and blah, 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 you can get lost in the weeds and never get to your story. So as you're world building, try to figure out what kind of story you're trying to tell and focus only on the elements that serve that story. There are things that can be assumed to be the same as real life. You don't have to explain everything. And again, all of this, technology, biology, chemistry, physics, when you're doing speculative versions of those sciences, they exist on a hard to soft spectrum. It's not strictly a binary. And you can have different aspects of the sciences that are more or less scientifically rigorous depending on what you're trying to do. Like I mentioned with Children of Time, it's very scientifically rigorous in terms of biology. However, in terms of technology, it's less so. So, that story that author's trying to tell is more about the biology than about the technology itself. And so, think about how all of those elements kind of go together to serve your story. Okay, I'm looking in the chat. Okay. That's it, actually. And we're like 2 minutes before, so I did a good job. So thanks y'all for coming. I do appreciate the discussion in the chat. I don't think I saw any questions. I'm scrolling through. But if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And also, I did want to say Writer's Lunch is free, and we do want it to always be free, and we want to provide, good free content.
I like how you're looking for a modifier first. Like,
Good.
because there's a lot out there, but
Yes.
yeah, we're not trying to BS people. Yeah.
Right. But yeah, we want to provide free content that's actually good and useful for you, and that is a lot of work on our end. So if you would like to donate to us to help support our free workshops, we would very much appreciate it. I have a QR code here. You can scan it, and it'll take you to our PayPal, and you can make a donation to us as well.
And also let us
point out
know.
there's some other stuff that we haven't really talked about as far as donations go, but like we are on Meetup. We also host the Houston Science Fiction and Fantasy Meetup group there. And one of the things is those cost money. So for the past, I don't know, what have we been doing? Like 5-6 years? We've been paying out of pocket. And the way some of this stuff goes is that we have to define whether or not that continues to make sense. So we're not like trying to scare you. It's just like, we may have to redefine what we do here. If you are on Meetup, I would also suggest following us in other places. If we do end up having to drop that, it's because their stuff has changed as well as far as cost and role. But it also helps us get coffee and chat together and actually like sit down and have a good time with you guys. So yeah, trying not to totally jump on Anna, but also pointing out that finances do impact our ability to continue to provide these things every week in the same way we've been doing it religiously for years now.
Yeah, thanks, Shannon. I do see one question in the chat about the 3-body problem. And I will say, so as far as the dehydrating and rehydrating people goes, there are certain species of animals that can be dehydrated / frozen and like essentially die and then come back to life afterwards. And so that is biologically possible. Not so much for humans as far as we know, but it does exist on Earth. So you should look, I can't remember what the species of frog is, but there's a particular species of frog, and this one has to deal with being frozen, but this particular species of frog has antifreeze in its blood that allows it to be frozen every winter and then thaw in the spring and still be alive.
It's got to be a Canadian. It's got to be a Canadian.
Yeah, it's some sort of subarctic frog. It lives somewhere in some northern region where it
wood
freezes.
Frogs can do that.
What?
It's just wood frogs. Wood frogs can do that.
Oh, wood frogs. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of different kinds that do, but you can freeze a wood frog and it come back to life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and that goes for, dehydrating as well. These are things that are possible, even if they're not necessarily possible, or we don't know that they're necessarily possible for people. And then as far as the space travel of the aliens, I mean, yeah, the aliens, aliens aren't necessarily hard sci-fi because we don't know that aliens exist, so they kind of exist outside of the hard sci-fi aspects of that book. Okay, let's see. Okay, I don't see any other questions in the chat.
I also don't see an example on the internet of how frogs dehydrate and come back. I'll find it. I will, I swear.
Yeah, I'll have to go back to the deep knowledge. I'm sure I have a book somewhere. But anyway, all right. Well, thank you all for coming. It's a little bit after 2:00. I appreciate y'all being here. Again, next week, Shannon's going to talk about reverse outlines, which is a really cool tool for drafting and, figuring out your story when you're trying to do revisions. And then if you're interested in my series on tech and magic, my next one, I don't know the date in August that it will be, but it will be in August, and that will be magic in speculative fiction. So, okay. Well, thanks, everyone. We will see y'all next week.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks.
Thank you, Anna.
Thanks, Anna.
Thank you. Oh, I forgot. I'm the host. I have to end this. Whoops.